Hi, this is Rabbi Shmuel Kopel. I know I didn't make a video in a really long time. The reason is because I moved office. As you can see in the background, I am in the ancient city of Tzfat. I have an office that actually looks like I'm in the ancient city of Tzfat. This video is actually going to be asking and hopefully answering a very important question, is why does Judaism, as well as many other monotheistic religions, want to believe that there's only one God? Why can't there be many different gods? Now, that is a very deep question, and I'm going to try to answer it from a few different perspectives. The main perspective I'm going to be focusing on is the Kabbalistic perspective. So if you hold on, you're going to be understanding something that you probably may have been wondering for years. I mean, why is the Jews so stubborn? It says Abraham was willing to die just to say that there's one God and no other. Why? I mean, how is he so sure, and why? I know I keep on saying that, but many people I've asked this question and didn't come up with a good answer. Before we get into it, I want to ask you once again, if you haven't done it yet, please do me a favor and click the subscribe button right under the screen and click the bell that will appear after you click it. Once you click that bell, you'll be notified every time I upload a new video. I will try to do these videos approximately once or twice a week. Hope to see you back. As well, I do want to mention, forget about it. We won't speak about that now. Let's go straight into why is it that Judaism, at least, believes there's one God and there's no other God whatsoever. Okay. In order to understand that, we have to understand a few things of how Judaism defines a God. Okay, many people define a God as some spiritual being that has some power over us. And if that's a God, well, perhaps there may be many. That's not necessarily the God that Judaism is speaking about. Judaism, as well as many monotheistic religions, are focusing on the creator of all, which essentially means the source of everything. Okay, so we're not just talking about a God, a power, a spiritual existence that's beyond our knowledge. We're talking about the source, the creator, where everything came from. Now, I'm not going to get into this in this particular video. If you want, you can ask in the comments or you can discuss that in the comments. Essentially, the source of all has to be infinite. Okay, there's a long discussion in Kabbalah why the source needs to be infinite. It's way beyond the scope of one video, but there is a system of thought to show why the source of everything is infinite. Now, many people use the word infinity. Yes, God's infinite, infinity all over the place, without properly understanding what that means. Infinite essentially means it's beyond definition. You cannot define it. So, for example, some people say numbers can go on forever, so they're infinite. But in reality, numbers are not infinite because numbers are numbers and they're not anything other than numbers. For example, you cannot drive your car with numbers. You need your gasoline to drive your car, right? You could have as many numbers as you want. It's not going to drive your car, right? Numbers, when you say infinite numbers, you're actually defining it. You're saying it's defined as numbers and it goes infinitely, okay? It's not true infinity because it is defined as numbers. When we speak about true infinity, we speak about infinitely infinite, which means that it is infinite in every way, shape, or form, which means you cannot define what it is or what it isn't. The second you can define what it isn't, you can define something what it is. Okay? So true infinity means that it doesn't have any definition. It technically is everywhere, everything, etc. Now, the question I have for you is, how many such entities could possibly exist? Which means, how many infinite entities could possibly exist? I want you to take a few seconds and think about it. How many such entities could possibly exist? Okay? Most people that I ask this question, they answer infinite. There could be infinite entities. There's a little problem with that. Okay? If I were to take matter, for example, I would take sand, I would take water, and I would fill this room to the brink. I would fill the entire room with water, with sand, etc. Could I put more water or more sand inside? The answer is no, because it's full. Once something's full, you cannot put something else inside. I know many people will start speaking about pressure. The reason why you can pressurize more water into a space that normally can't hold that water is because really water is not entirely solid. So essentially there's room inside the water and you're pressurizing the water. You're basically just squeezing the water to take up less, well, to have less room inside of it. Especially on the atomic level, everything has, space in between the electron and the protons and the neutrons. There's space. There's a lot of space there. So essentially, when you condense something, you're just condensing it. But hypothetically, if all the space was full, you can't put anything else because the space is taken. All right. If there was one infinite entity, that infinite entity would, by definition, take up all space, all time, every idea. You can't come up with a new idea because it has to exist in infinity. Because if it didn't exist in infinity, then infinity does not include that idea. And if it doesn't include that idea, you just defined it. You defined it as everything besides one idea, or everything besides the ability to have a particular idea. So true infinity that has no definition, there's no way to say what it is or what it isn't. There could only really be one such entity, because if there was such an entity, it would already take up all space, all time, every idea, etc. If there was two such entities, the first entity would not include the second, and the second would not include the first. And therefore, by definition, there cannot be two infinite entities, truly infinite entities, which essentially means that there is only one. Now, that is the Kabbalistic reason why we believe there's only one God, because the God we're referring to is infinite. And therefore, by definition, it cannot be more than one. It's impossible that it's more than one. As a matter of fact, in Deuteronomy, which is actually said in many of the Jewish prayers, V'yadata hayom v'hashivoisa elavavecha ki Hashem hu lakim ein oid. We say that we should think and we should bring into our hearts that God is the God in heaven and in the earth. There is no other. It doesn't say there is no other God. There is no anything else. Because if there was anything outside of infinity, by definition, it would not be infinite, because it would be everything besides the other thing. I hope you're getting what I'm saying. Basically, if the space is taken, there's no place for anything else. So, that number one, that's why Judaism essentially believes that there's one God, because the God that we refer to, there can't be more than one. The way we describe, or lack of description of God, when we say God doesn't have an image, it means there is no image, positive or negative. You can't say he is or he isn't anything. Therefore, by definition, there could only be one. The problem with that way of thinking, which is a Kabbalistic way of thinking, is that if God exists, then who are you? How do you exist? That is actually for another video, because it's beyond the scope of this particular discussion. But it is discussed, and there's a lot of depth in Kabbalistic thought specifically about who are you? What are you? If God's everything, then you're nothing. Because if you're something, then God's not everything. He's everything besides you. Some people say, okay, well, my body may just be a delusion. Well, if your body's a delusion, that's fine. But what about your soul? And what about your true reality? What about your ability to experience? You're actually experiencing something. That is something. The experience itself is something. And if that something is not God, or is not included in God, then all of a sudden, God's not infinite. So that's another interesting area of Kabbalistic thought that you might want to think about. Perhaps we can get to it. Please, if you have any comments, I would love to hear what you have to say. Now, that is the complicated Kabbalistic way of thinking. I want to share with you a little bit more practical and simple way of knowing why we only believe in one God, and why many religions only believe in one God. Before I do that, I do want to mention that there's a lot of things that I'm doing every day, and I have somewhat limited time, and I would love to do more of these videos, and I would love to share a lot more than I am at the current moment. In the link below, there's a link that says Patreon. If you click Patreon, you can support this work. And if you support this work, you are literally giving me the power and the chance to make more of these videos and to publish more articles, whether you see me on Facebook and Medium, etc. I would love to spend more time doing this. The more supporters I have, obviously, the more I can do that at the current moment. So I want to go to another way of understanding why we believe that there is only one God. And that is as follows. Everything has a source. Okay, you have a source. Just your source are your parents. Your parents are from their parents. Their parents are from their parents. Everything comes from something else. Now, of course, not everything could come from everything. Because not everything could come from something else because there had to be a start. Because if there was no start, there would be no end. Okay, so let's imagine ourselves going back where all matter, all energy, all humanity, all beings came from. So, for example, scientifically, the theory of evolution, perhaps I think, again, I'm not a master in that particular theory, but I believe it starts from algae. There's some type of algae that then evolves into something else, that then evolves into something else. So let's go to the original. Well, where did the algae come from, and how did it get there, and what, et cetera, et cetera. You go back to the original source. Everything has to come from something else. However, there has to be an origin. Now, if there were two origins, two separate origins, then essentially, how did two separate origins come into existence? For example, if algae could evolve into other beings, then it would evolve into other beings. So let's just say algae would be the root source of everything. If algae was the root source of everything, well, then algae would keep on pumping out new organisms, okay? Because that's a source, and therefore it keeps on creating that, one after the next after the next. So if you have two sources, well, how did they both get there? There had to be a source that created them, whether it was an energy, whether it was a certain pattern of movement. Something had to create them. If there's two, then some phenomenon had to let them out, right? There had to be. How else could two things get there? And if two things get there, why is there only two? There could be three, there could be four, there could be five. Right? Because if something is a source, if something is made to generate and to let out new beings, then it would let out new beings. It would let out one, it would let out another. That's what it does. That's what its nature would be to let out new beings. So the second you have two, which means that there's a same phenomenon repeated itself at least twice, that means there was a phenomenon that allowed a God or a reality to come into existence. Okay? However, remember, there has to be a source of everything. There has to be an origin to everything. And that origin has to be a singular, because the singular origin could then spit out numerous entities. It's the origin. It's now letting out numerous things. Whereas if two things were the origin, well, that means that how did two things just appear? If two things just appear, then a third thing could just appear, and a fourth thing could just appear, and perhaps a new God will. If God just appeared on his own, well, maybe another God will appear on its own, right? How did the first God appear on its own, right? Which a lot of people ask, where did God come from? Essentially, it's not where God come from. It's what made him make us, right? God is the origin, and that's, again, essentially Judaic teachings. In Judaic teachings, as well as many monotheistic religions, we refer to God as the origin of everything, whatever that is. Now, that origin, the origin of everything, has to be a singular, as I explained, because if it wasn't a singular, if it was two, that means two things could just appear. If two things could just appear, what phenomenon, what reality allowed two things to appear? If the reality allowed two things to appear, if the reality allowed two things to appear, that means there had to be a reality that predated them that allowed both of those things to be a phenomenon, which means the phenomenon itself would be the source and not what appears. So essentially, the ultimate source of everything has to be one. So that's a more practical way. I know both of them don't seem very practical, and you're probably going to look back at me and say, I can't understand either of them. Whatever you do understand or whatever comments you have, please do me a favor and uh, click the link. Put them in your comments below. I would love to hear your comments. I will try my best to answer if you have any questions. And of course, you could reach me directly on Facebook at Shmuel Kopel. That's SHMUEL KOPEL. You could also reach me on rabbi@spirix.org. That's RABBI at Spirix, SPIRX.org. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I hope to see you again. Rabbi Shmuel Kopel here. Have a nice day. See you again next time.